is Series 3 of Away, a podcast for anyone exploring 12-step sobriety. I'm your host, Steph Roberts. Hello, and welcome to Series 3, the first episode. In this series, we're going to go through the 12 and 12. The 12 steps and the 12 traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous. As ever, we're going to try and make it more accessible to people or to more people. So, same goal, new book. Before we dive into the book itself, let's start at the very, very beginning of it with the introduction. And just let me rant for a sec. So first of all, the book was published in 1953, and that's 14 years after the publication of the big book. And while it does show us a little of Bill's changes, I don't want to say evolution exactly, but changes, I don't think we see enough. I kind of don't think it's honest enough. There are other writings from him around the same period that paint a much clearer picture. Before we get into the context, let's take a quick look at the introduction. Obviously, I have to comment. In recent years, some members and friends of AA have asked if it would be wise to update the language, idioms, and historical references in the book to present a more contemporary image for the fellowship. However, because the book has helped so many alcoholics find recovery, there exists strong sentiment within the fellowship against any change to it. In fact, the 2002 General Service Conference discussed this issue, and it was unanimously recommended that the text in the book, 12 Steps and 12 Traditions, written by Bill W., remain as is, recognizing the fellowship's feelings that Bill's writings be retained as originally published. Now, if you know me, you might think I would disagree with this. And of course I do, but only in part. First, I just need to rant for a second about the capital F fellowship. I mean, honestly, if we want to stay away from that culty stigma feeling, then one way might be to stop calling it the fellowship with a capital F. Just a thought. Anyway, I'd also like to point out that 2002 is now fully 17 years ago, so perhaps the discussion should be had again. However, I'm not actually an advocate of a rewrite, not of the 12 and 12 and not of the big book. I mean, would I like it? Sure. But these books are our foundation. They have a lot to offer us. To fully understand how AA became what it is and how the men who founded this quote-unquote simple program of recovery came to understand what they had done and why it worked, I mean, it's brilliant. Really. We are nothing without history. Was it Marcus Garvey who said something like a people without knowledge of their history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots? Without these books by those men, we don't have a fellowship, lowercase f or uppercase f. We don't have a fellowship of men and women who share their experience, strength, and hope. Right? So to change the original books, in my opinion, isn't the answer. To write updated books might be better. I mean, we have a system to update our Constitution. We know the Founding Fathers were geniuses, but we also know that they weren't psychics. It's why we have a system wherein you can amend things, because another saying, what's that saying? Wise men don't lay down on the tracks of history and wait for the train of the future to run them over. Don't ask me who said that, but it wasn't me. Okay, so before we go any further into the book, let's look at the context of it. And here, more so than with the big book, I want to look at the writer himself. The 12 and 12 was written by Bill, alone, basically. He had the help of a friend named Tom Powers, who I think had been in advertising, and a magazine editor named Betty Love. But the language and the messages are really Bill's. When Bill et al. Wrote the big book, he, like most of them, were sort of high, so to speak, on new sobriety, on early sobriety. But Bill actually suffered from what we now call, and I think it's only been a few decades that we've really identified it as clinical depression. And he went through bouts of very serious depression. He wrote the 12 and 12 when he was in one of those deep depressions. In an article by Susan Cheever on thefix.com, she writes, quote, "The three," meaning Bill, Tom, and Betty, "met in the morning in Wits End, the cinder block office Bill had built on a ridge above his house. Soon after they began the work, Bill was felled with the third disabling depression of his life, which he called a period of blackness. Some mornings," Tom Powers later told me, "Bill would just put his head down on his desk and weep while Powers and Love tapped out the new steps on Bill's typewriter." Bill's mood had also become much darker. After 15 years leading AA, he was tired. He felt an enormous burden of responsibility and expectation. In fact, he introduced a resolution that passed in 1955 to turn AA over to its members. So first, depression, we know we have options for that now. He didn't. There just wasn't that. But the mood of the writer, the depression of the writer matters. So as we move through the book, I want you to carry that with you. There's a lot of ferocious sounding stuff in here. But he was a damaged man. And I think they mean by turning it over to its members is that up until 1955, it's almost like Bill was a leader. And I think, the anonymity, he didn't get to have that. He wasn't like us. He didn't get to be anonymous and enjoy the program the way we do now. So that's a lot of pressure. And if you're already suffering with depression, that is, unwanted gravy. I will refer to this article again later. It's a great piece, and I will try to remember to put the link in the description. So not only is Bill's depression evident in the 12 and 12, it's important. And as I said, I think it's important because a lot of the language of the book appears to be in opposition to the language of the big book. We're putting the happy, high, pink cloud against the darkness. And I really do think it's important for you as the reader to keep it in mind. So to take some of what we're going to read with the proverbial grain of salt. I also think it's important to know why the book was written. Bill's original plan was to write bylaws, so to speak, for Alcoholics Anonymous in response to questions he'd received from groups around the world about, I guess, what we'd refer to as best practices. He also thought that since the big book did not expound enough on the steps individually, this would actually be an ideal opportunity to go deeper. The problem, of course, is that he's in this completely different mindset, and the world has changed a lot, and so, there are a lot of contradictions, if you're looking for them. I'd like to say that this is why the Thumpers stick close to the big book and don't give the 12 and 12 as much cred, but mostly I don't think the Thumpers think enough to actually understand that. They just see the big book as a Bible. And, in fact, the 12 and 12 is rough in parts. It's got some difficult language to plow through, especially if you're of the sensitive variety. But, it's real, or it's a reflection of reality. The reality of change, of evolution, the reality of mental health, mental illness. If you've listened to me before, you know that I think most of us drink to medicate something. Now, we are different from others because we metabolize alcohol differently, become addicted to it, but all I'm saying is see a psychiatrist, not your GP, not a therapist, a psychiatrist. If you need medication and you don't get it, staying sober is a lot harder. It's what the stupid people call a dry drunk. Kids, a good, strong program is not the answer to severe depression or anxiety or bipolar. A good program gets you in good enough shape to treat your other health issues, including your mental health. A good program keeps you off the booze for long enough to start work on the other things. You're not depressed 2 years into sobriety because you didn't go on a deep enough dive in step 4, I promise. It may help, but it just isn't the cure for most of us. Bill will contradict me in the book. Okay, let's look at this nasty little book. We'll start the book and end the episode by just reading through the contents, which seems like nothing, but the contents, each step in tradition is given quite a succinct summary. We'll look at the foreword in the next episode, and I fear I may need a whole episode to properly pick it apart. Onward. Okay, content. Forward, page 15. The 12 steps. Step 1. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. Who cares to admit complete defeat? Admission of powerlessness is the first step in liberation. Relation of humility to sobriety. Mental obsession plus physical allergy. Why must every AA hit bottom? Step 2. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. What can we believe in? AA does not demand belief. 12 steps are only suggestions. Importance of an open mind. Variety of ways to faith. Substitution of AA as higher power. Plight of the disillusioned. Roadblocks of indifference and prejudice. Lost faith found in AA. Problems of intellectuality and self-sufficiency. Negative and positive thinking, self-righteousness. Defiance is an outstanding characteristic of alcoholics. Step 2 is a rallying point to sanity, right relation to God. Step 3, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. Step 3 is like opening of a locked door. How shall we let God into our lives? Willingness is the key. Dependence as a means to independence. Of course, I really like that. Dependence on the group. Sorry. Dangers of self-sufficiency, turning our will over to a higher power. Misuse of willpower. Sustained and personal exertion necessary to conform to God's will. Step 4. Made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. How instincts can exceed their proper function. Step 4 is an effort to discover our liabilities, basic problem of extremes and instinctive drives. Misguided moral inventory can result in guilt, grandiosity, or blaming others. Assets can be noted with liabilities. Self-justification is dangerous. Willingness to take inventory brings light and new confidence. Step 4 is the beginning of a lifetime practice. Common symptoms of emotional insecurity are worry, anger, self-pity, and depression. Inventory reviews relationships, importance of thoroughness. Step 5. Admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being, the exact nature of our wrongs. 12 steps to flay ego. Step 5 is difficult but necessary to sobriety and peace of mind. I'm just going to pause here for a minute. You know how I feel about the ego thing for us sensitive peeps. So don't worry. When we get into that chapter, we're going to re-examine that and look at it through a slightly different lens. Back to the text. Without fearless admission of defects, few could stay sober. What do we receive from step 5? Beginning of true kinship with man and God. Lose sense of isolation. Receive forgiveness and give it. Learn humility. Gain honesty and realism about ourselves. Necessity for complete honesty. Danger of rationalization. How to choose the person in whom to confide. Results are tranquility and consciousness of God, oneness with God, and man prepares us for following steps. Oneness with God and man prepares us for following steps. Step 6. We're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. Step 6. Necessary to spiritual growth, the beginning of a lifetime job. Recognition of difference between striving for objective and perfection. Why we must keep trying. Being ready is all important. Necessity of taking action. Delay is dangerous. Rebellion may be fatal. Point at which we abandon limited objectives and move toward God's will for us. Step 7. Humbly asked him to remove our shortcomings. And yes, I promise we will reword all of this for the secular AA, the atheist AA. Not to worry, that's me. Step 7. Humbly asked him to remove our shortcomings. What is humility? What can it mean to us? The avenue to true freedom of the human spirit. Necessary aid to survival. Value of ego puncturing. Failure and misery transformed by humility. Strength from weakness. Pain is the admission price to new life. Self-centered fear, chief activator of defects. Step 7 is change in attitude, which permits us to move out of ourselves towards God. Step 8. Made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. This and the next 2 steps are concerned with personal relations. Learning to live with others is a fascinating adventure. Obstacles. Reluctance to forgive. Non-admission of wrongs to others. Purposeful forgetting. Necessity of exhaustive survey of past. Deepening insights. Result from thoroughness. Kinds of harm done to others. Avoiding extreme judgments. Taking the objective view. Step 8 is the beginning of the end of isolation. Step 9. Made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. A tranquil mood is the first requisite for good judgment. Good timing is important in making amends. What is courage? Prudence means taking calculated chances. Amends begin when we join AA. Peace of mind cannot be bought at the expense of others. Need for discretion, readiness to take consequences of our past, and to take responsibility for well-being of others is the spirit of Step 9. Step 10. Continued to take personal inventory and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. Can we stay sober and keep emotional balance under all conditions? Self-searching becomes a regular habit. Admit, accept, and patiently correct defects. Emotional hangover. When past is settled with present challenges can be met. When past is settled, present challenges can be met. Varieties of inventory. Anger, resentment, jealousy, envy, self-pity, hurt, pride, all led to the bottle. Self-restraint, first objective. Insurance against big shotism. Let's look at credits as well as debits. Examination of motives. Step 11. Sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for His knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. Meditation and prayer remain channels to a higher power. Connection between self-examination and meditation and prayer. An unshakable foundation for life. How shall we meditate? Meditation has no boundaries. An individual adventure. First result is emotional balance. What about prayer? Daily petitions for understanding of God's will and grace to carry it out. Actual results of prayer are beyond question. Rewards of meditation and prayer. And step 12, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. This chapter is going to look at the joy of living as a theme of the 12th step. Action is the key word. Giving that asks no reward. Love that has no price tag. What is a spiritual awakening? A new state of consciousness and being is received as a free gift. Readiness to receive free gift lies in the practice of the 12 steps. The magnificent reality. Rewards of helping other alcoholics. Kinds of 12-step work. Problems of 12-step work. What about the practice of these principles in all our affairs? Monotony, pain, and calamity turn to good use by practice of steps. Difficulties of practice. 2-stepping. Switch to 12-stepping and demonstrations of faith. Growing spirituality is the answer to our problems. Placing spiritual growth first. Domination and overdependence. Putting our lives on give and take basis. Dependence upon God necessary to recovery of all alcoholics. Practicing these principles in all our affairs, domestic relations in AA, outlook upon material matters changes. So do feelings about personal importance, instincts restored to true purpose. Understanding is key to right attitudes, right action, key to good living. Okay, so those are the brief, sort of poorly written summaries of each of the 12 steps as they will appear in the 12 and 12. And now we have the 12 traditions. They begin on page 129. Tradition 1. Our common welfare should come first. Personal recovery depends upon AA unity. Without unity, AA dies. Individual liberty, yet great unity. Key to paradox. Each AA's life depends on obedience to spiritual principles. The group must survive, or the individual will not. Common welfare comes first. How best to live and work together as groups. Tradition 2. For our group purpose, there is but one ultimate authority, a loving God, as He may express Himself in our group conscience. Our leaders are but trusted servants, they do not govern. Where does AA get its direction? Sole authority in AA is loving God as He may express Himself in the group conscience. Formation of a group, growing pains, rotating committees or servants of the group. Leaders do not govern, they serve. Does AA have real leadership? Elder statesmen versus bleeding deacons, group conscience. Tradition 3. The only requirement for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking. Early intolerance based on fear. To take away any alcoholic's chance, an AA was sometimes to pronounce his death sentence. Membership regulations abandoned. 2 examples of experience. Any alcoholic is a member of AA when he or she says so. Tradition 4. Each group should be autonomous except in matters affecting other groups or AA as a whole. Every group manages its affairs as it pleases except when AA as a whole is threatened. Is such liberty dangerous? The group, like the individual, must eventually conform to principles that guarantee survival. 2 storm signals. A group ought not to do anything which would injure AA as a whole, nor affiliate itself with outside interests. An example was the AA Center that didn't work. Tradition 5. Each group has but one primary purpose: to carry the message to the alcoholic who still suffers. Better to do one thing well than many badly. The life of our fellowship depends on this principle. The ability of each AA to identify himself with and bring recovery to the newcomer is a gift from God. Passing on this gift to others is our one aim. Sobriety can't be kept unless it's given away. Tradition 6. An AA group ought never endorse, finance, or lend the AA name to any related facility or outside enterprise, lest problems of money, property, and prestige divert us from our primary purpose. Experience proved that we could not endorse any related enterprise, no matter how good. We could not be all things to all men. We saw that we could not lend the AA name to any outside activity. Tradition 7. Every AA group ought to be fully self-supporting, declining outside contributions. No AA tradition had the labor pains this one did. Collective poverty, initially a matter of necessity. Fear of exploitation. Necessity of separating the spiritual from the material. Decision to subsist on AA voluntary contributions only. Placing the responsibility of supporting AA headquarters directly upon AA members. Bare running expenses plus a prudent reserve is headquarters policy. Tradition 8. Alcoholics Anonymous should remain forever non-professional, but our service centers may employ special workers. You can't mix the 12th step and money. Line of cleavage between voluntary 12th step work and paid-for services. AA could not function without full-time service workers. Professional workers are not professional AAs. Relation of AA to industry, education, etc. 12th step work is never paid for, but those who labor in the service for us are worthy of their hire. Tradition 9. AA, as such, ought never be organized, but we may create service boards or committees directly responsible to those they serve. Special service boards and committees, the General Service Conference, the Board of Trustees, and group committees cannot issue directives to AA members or groups. AAs can't be dictated to, individually or collectively. Absence of coercion works because unless each AA follows suggested steps to recovery, he signs his own death warrant. Same condition apply to the group. Suffering and love are AA's disciplinarians. Difference between spirit of authority and spirit of service. Aim of our services is to bring sobriety within reach of all who want it. Tradition 10. Alcoholics Anonymous has no opinion on outside issues, hence the AA name ought never be drawn into public controversy. So AA does not take sides in any public controversy. Reluctance to fight is not a special virtue. Survival and spread of AA are our primary aims, lessons learned from Washingtonian movement. And we'll get into that again. We mentioned it briefly in Series 2, in the episodes about the history of AA. Tradition 11. Our public relations policy is based on attraction rather than promotion. We need always maintain personal anonymity at the level of press, radio, and films. Public relations are important to AA. Good public relations save lives. We seek publicity for AA principals, not AA members. The press has cooperated. Personal anonymity at the public level is the cornerstone of our public relations policy. 11th tradition is a constant reminder that personal ambition has no place in AA. Each member becomes an active guardian of our fellowship. I'll just take a minute here because this is where some people will rail a little bit against the podcast format, and it's why I periodically say this is my experience only. This is my view, this is my opinion, this is how I read it, this is how I did it, because I don't speak for AA as a whole. I only speak for myself. This is a program that worked for me, but this is the way I did it and how it worked just for me. Tradition 12, anonymity is the spiritual foundation of all our traditions, ever reminding us to place principles before personalities. Spiritual substance of anonymity is sacrifice. Subordinating personal aims to the common good is the essence of all 12 traditions. Why AA could not remain a secret society. Principles come before personalities. 100% anonymity at the public level. Anonymity is real humility. I mean, we'll get into that more. Take it as you will now. Your personal anonymity, that's not what this is about. You can choose who to reveal it to. You can't choose anyone else. So no matter who else is in that room, the only choice you have is over your own anonymity in public. Like, I choose not to remain anonymous, but you will never hear the name of another alcoholic in any of my groups come from my lips. Okay. With that, we'll end. I think that's a lot. So thank you for listening to the first episode of Series 3. And I hope it helped or gave a glimmer of hope if you didn't have one when you clicked play. As I always say, I can't make any promises. Except one, really. You can be free. I promise there is a